Hello, this is Blaine again. And I started using drugs, firstly alcohol, when I was about 15 years of age. And that was on very, very small amounts, beer and lemonade shandies. And then I graduated to baby sham, sherry, and other drinks, but never drinking very much until I was about 18 years of age. I remember the first time I got tipsy, I would say, very light-headed. I was standing on a bridge over the River Wye, where I grew up in Wales, and my head was just spinning, looking down at the river. It was an interesting feeling. Um, I never had that sort of tipsy feeling again. I just basically got drunk. To skip forward, by the time I was 25, I was making quite a lot of money in London. And I'd gone up through the cycle of sales promotions, starting in basic sales and then management and through several lines of management. So I was doing quite well. But what I'd learned when I first moved to London, I'd started a mix with people who were quite influential in some ways. They were all young accountants, bankers, and uh, several of these were renting apartments owned by insurance companies. And what I discovered was that if I put my name down, I would be eventually get on the waiting list, and I would be given one. So in the end, I had five of these places in Mayfair, Putney, another two at Marble Arch, and so on. On the outside, it all looked as though I was doing extremely well. I was a member of prestigious clubs in London and so on. And the doctor who I'd gone to see about a pain in my stomach, actually, which was actually caused from eating too much chocolate, prescribed Valium. So by the time I was 25, I was hooked on Valium, literally on a very large amount every day, and alcohol. And I could afford to get drunk every night, so virtually every night I got drunk. Nothing really very much happened except that um, it gave me a lot of exciting things. I went to a lot of clubs and I became a chess player, a bridge player, tennis player, a squash player, all at a reasonable level, nothing brilliant, but just good enough to enjoy and mix with what were very nice people. I was the odd one out, but in those days, because I was successful, nobody cared, and I gave a lot of parties, very big parties, and I lived in Bryanston Court, George Street, Marble Arch, and it was one of these very upmarket flats. Uh, and so just having a party there was impressive. But my main drink was always champagne and cases of it, not bottles. Um, but from 30 years onwards, it was downhill all the way. And until the time I was 35, I was in a terrible state. And I knew that alcohol was the problem. I hadn't realized that the other drugs that I was taking were a problem as well. By now, I was smoking cannabis, taking sleeping pills every night. And I was not just taking one or two, I was taking three or four and up to five. I was taking 150 to 200 milligrams of Valium every day and drinking 4 or 5 bottles of wine a day. So I was a wreck. I started to get arrested, and I lost my driving license twice. I was locked up for drunk and disorderly, drunk and incapable. I was put in jails, in police cells in France, in the UK, and California. I was actually virtually deported from California because on the drunken spree I had there, I lost my passport and everything, and the police had to find all these things. So they basically said, get out of the country. And life was a mess. Anyway, in when I was 35, I persuaded a doctor's daughter, a friend of mine, to go with me to Venice. And the whole reason for taking her was that she was a doctor's daughter, and I thought she might be able to help me quit alcohol. Unfortunately, that wasn't to be the case. The very first night we went to Harry's bar, and I absolutely got blitzed and disgraced myself. The following morning, I was in a very bad way with a rotten hangover, but I was used to that, and she didn't want to know me. Anyway, we stayed together, walked together around Venice, and we'd arranged to go and see some of the better known churches. And at one of these, we had a flaming row right outside the church. Absolutely awful row. And she left me. She said, "That's it. I've had enough. You were a disgrace last night, and everything else." But I knew I was beaten. And because I knew I was beaten, it was about midday. I sat on the steps of that church and I cried my eyes out. I just could not stop crying because I knew I was beaten. I knew I was going to die from alcohol. And anyway, long story short, 5 years later, I met a wonderful woman who introduced me through her best friend to Alcoholics Anonymous. I'd like to say that I haven't had a drink or a drug since. It took me a few months for that to happen. But when it did, I surrendered completely to what they suggested in AA, and I've lived a wonderful life ever since, and a sober, drug free life. Something had happened there that I hadn't realized, and it's the basis of my story. As I said, I was lying on the steps, crying my eyes out at this church. And by the time I was 2 years sober, I was a successful stockbroker in London dealing with the banks in Europe. And I was on a business trip and I had the a weekend free. And I had no idea what to do. So I thought, well, I'm down in Rome. My next meetings are in Switzerland, in Zurich and Geneva. I'll hop off in Venice, spend the weekend there, and carry on my business trip. So on the Friday night, I'm flying into Venice, and I picked up before I left the original guidebook that I'd bought when I went to Venice 5 years previously. And as we were landing, I was looking down at the city, the wonderful outline, and this postcard fell out of the book, out of the guidebook, and I had no idea where it had come from or what it was or anything. Anyway, I turned it over, and there was this picture, a very old picture of the inside of that church. And I turned it over, and to look at what the name of the church was. It was called Santa Maria de Miracoli, the church Saint Mary of the Miracle. And the following morning, I went to that church, and everything came back to me as to what had happened. Everything. And I knew from that moment on that cry from the heart had been heard by some guardian angel, higher power, whatever. And I knew that I was basically put on the right track to get clean and sober. And that's my alcohol story. And the next podcast will cover a progression from there.